Welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Fox Penner, professor of the practice at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University and director of the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy.
And I'm Jackie Ashmore. I'm the executive director of Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy and research associate professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Earth and Environment.
Thank you for joining us today for our very special conversation with Congressman Sean Casten. This is part of our Energy of the Future series, and we hope you'll join all of the recordings.
I'd like to say a big thank you to our Energy of the Future series sponsors, the Northeast Clean Energy Council and the Boston University Energy and Sustainability Club. Also, thank you to today's webinar sponsors, Advanced Energy Economy, National Association of State Energy Officials, the Boston University Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, and the Boston University Department of Political Science.
So let me now introduce the Congressman, our very special guest. He represents the 6th District of Illinois, one of those all-important suburban swing districts we hear so much about, where he just won re-election. He's a member of the Space, Science, and Technology Committee, the Financial Services Committee, and perhaps of most relevance today, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. He has an extraordinarily unique background that puts him at the front lines of energy and climate policy and a real leader amongst his peers on Capitol Hill. He has degrees in biochemistry and engineering. He's worked as a management consultant and as an entrepreneur, as a CEO of an energy company, and he's also the founder of an energy nonprofit. We're really, really honored to have you with us, Congressman, and we turn the floor over to you for some opening thoughts.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you all for having me here. It's nice virtually to be back in Boston, having lived there for a long time. My wife is actually a BU Business School grad. I went to BC undergrad, and I think I've lived the dream of all people who've ever lived in Boston. When I got out of college, I lived on the B line, and then I was able to upgrade to the C line, and then finally got to the red line before I left New England. So I'm sure you guys can sympathize. I want to maybe just sort of set the table of what we need to do, what we can do, and sort of set out some ambition for the next term. And I emphasize in that sequence because I think so often in politics we start by saying what's politically possible. And if we don't start by saying what's scientifically necessary, we've done our grandchildren a disservice. When it comes to climate, there's only 3 things we have to do. We have to at least double our energy efficiency. We have to do the R&D necessary to figure out how to decarbonize industries that we have no idea how to decarbonize right now. And then we have to get back to 1985 atmospheric CO2 levels. If we do all those 3 things, we're good. In a little bit more detail on that, by doubling efficiency, I'm not talking about just building efficiency. I'm saying the total energy we use in BTUs, whether solar energy or coal energy or anything, total BTUs per dollar of GDP. If we double that in the United States, we will get to the level that Switzerland has already achieved. There are no technological barriers to doing that. There are no talent barriers to doing it. There are no capital barriers to do that. There's just removing existing barriers to doing that. So that's step 1. We'll probably reduce CO2 by something like 70% if we do that, because the most expensive sources of energy on our grid are also the most carbon intensive. And going a push for clean energy is also a push for cheap energy. Those 2 things are synonymous. The problem is we can't get to 0. Anybody who stands up and says, I pledge to you as a politician, I'll get to 0 CO2 by 2030, should be taken as seriously as someone who says, I will eliminate the deficit by 2030. If you don't have a path to get there, it is just a soundbite. How do you make steel without coke? How do you make fertilizer without natural gas? How do you make cement? How do you make a solar panel without steel and silicon and cement? And so we need to do the R&D to go through and do that. And then the third piece about 1985 is that while we have this huge urgent need to address matters of environmental justice, we have to recognize the fact that a commitment to environmental justice without negative emissions is essentially a bet that over the duration of our species time on this planet, we will consistently find the political will to look out for the least fortunate. I want to believe that's true. But if we don't want to live with regular flooding, regular wildfires, regular derechos coming through the Midwest, we got to figure out a way to get back to that 350 part per million or below level which is basically back to 1985. And by the way, 50% of all the CO2 that our species has ever emitted since we first learned how to burn things in a cave has been emitted since 1985. So we have to talk about what that means for negative emissions technologies. Now, what we did in the last term, I think of those three goals, the only thing I can say we really did was a bill that I led and we pushed through and got the omnibus, the Clean Industrial Technology Act, which is small, but it was a start. It was $500 million to set up an agency at Department of Energy to bring together all of those research projects to figure out how to decarbonize those hard to decarbonize industries and put some deployment out. Now, we did some other stuff too. There was a lot of good things that were in the omnibus package, but we really haven't tackled any of those structural barriers to growing our efficiency, and we didn't really do anything on negative emissions technologies. What a difference a president makes. We got to do a lot of stuff legislatively, but if you look at the executive orders that have come out of the Biden White House since getting sworn in, I think one of the biggest ones that needs more attention is his pledge to remove the subsidies to the fossil fuel sector. The International Monetary Fund has calculated the United States subsidizes the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $650 billion with a B dollars a year. That is essentially equal to our defense budget. There is no level of subsidy you can imagine giving to clean energy that would ever create a level playing field when the distortions are that big. But that also means we have an amazing opportunity, because if we get rid of those subsidies, we'll have more efficient markets, we'll have clean energy. Remember what I said before, a push for clean energy is the same as a push for cheap energy. And so this decision to do that, now it's going to be hard. Consider as an example, there was a really good one. This will date me a little bit, but for those of you who've been in New England a while, I remember when there was this push to shut down, I think they called it the Filthy Five, the coal plants that were out there. Harvard School of Public Health did a study where they looked at the downwind health impacts of coal at those 5 power plants. What was the differentially higher rate of asthma, differentially higher rate of premature mortality, and then they calculated the cost. If you took the cost that they calculated and divided that by the megawatt hours from those plants, worked out to, if memory serves, somewhere between $30 and $70 a megawatt hour, depending on what you think the actuarial value of a human life is. That means that the coal industry was getting 100% subsidy paid for by Medicaid. Think about that, right? That's a massive amount of wealth we can create. So the fact that Biden's doing that is a big deal. The fact that they're saying they want to factor the social cost of carbon into rate making, which means that we will actually do economic policy taking into account of the whole pie, not just the portion of the pie that we're looking at. And so factoring in some of those impacts, like I just mentioned, really, really big deal. And then using the power of the federal government to preferentially purchase cleaner energy. Federal government is a huge buyer of energy, largest buyer of energy in the country. Makes a big deal if they start using that power of the purse to not just to buy clean energy, but to create a buyer for clean energy. Because as a guy who built some 80 clean energy projects, the hardest thing to finance a deal is finding a creditworthy off-taker. The federal government is a AAA credit off-taker. It makes a really big deal when they say, I'll enter into a long-term contract. So there's some really big muscle movements, lots that will go on. Now, all of those things are by executive order. And I think our challenge going forward is going to be, what can we do legislatively to protect those, to bolster them? What sorts of things can you not do without legislative support? Congress does have the power of the purse. I think we'll certainly have good bipartisan support for infrastructure that will make a big difference in a green way. I think what's going to be harder, that we have to figure out how to make this politically possible. I don't want to give up on it. But as long as we still have the filibuster in place, it's going to be hard to make the kind of structural reforms we really need. Removing subsidies for fossil fuel, it's hard to do that without getting rid of the filibuster. I sit on the Financial Services Committee. I think there's going to be some really interesting things going on with the greening of the financial system, climate risk disclosure, a bill that I led last term, treating climate change as a systemic risk to our financial system. These are things that are really important that we need to do, to the extent those require congressional approval, correctional directive to get done. We've got to figure out a way to get those through narrow majorities in the House and Senate. And again, as long as we focus on what's necessary, we'll get it done. We just have to not give up once we say, well, the current political tea leaves don't allow this. Well, I'm not aware that any of my colleagues got elected by saying I'm incapable of leadership. If you got a problem, we got to figure out a way to lead through it. Just a couple other things before opening up to your questions about some of the harder issues. Really, really hard issues that anybody in this industry knows well about the conflict between state, federal, local policies. It's hard to undo those. For a whole lot of reasons, I think FERC could be possibly the most important climate player in the White House because they're the only federal agency that sort of uniquely has an ability to flex a little bit on some of those issues. How do you think about eminent domain for transmission line siting that's going to get clean power from one part of the country to the other? Is that a state issue? Is that a federal issue? Could the federal government flex a little bit? That's a FERC question. So I think there's going to be really interesting things at FERC, especially with Chairman Glick. We need a carbon price. We also need to acknowledge that I would submit to you almost the entire conversation about carbon pricing has lost a thread. The whole reason we want carbon pricing is because we believe that market-based tools are a good way to solve problems. I was mentioning at the start that Bill Riley is my idol for what he did in creating the Montreal Protocol, the acid rain trading programs. Those programs were set up with a basic market structure that says what you pay to emit a unit of pollution is the same as what you receive if you reduce a unit of pollution. And I would submit to you that virtually every carbon pricing regime we've developed has forgotten that. If you pay a price to the federal government to emit and the federal government decides how to allocate that money through society, that is not a market. It is a carbon tax, it's not a market. And even most programs like RGGI have so flushed the market with free allowances to pollute that effectively you have to pay for the right to pollute, but you don't get paid to reduce. I've got a bill we introduced last term to fix that. It's a totally different way of doing carbon pricing. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A if you want, but we need to get back to that. And then the last thing that I think we really have to have a hard and honest conversation about is the economic dislocation of this transition. The shifting to clean energy is a shift to cheaper energy. That's going to make us richer. We're going to have more money in our pocket. Shifting to clean energy is replacing old, amortized, high marginal cost capital with new capital that has a low marginal operating cost and is vastly more productive from a labor perspective. That's really, really good. But if there's less money throwing through the economy because we're paying less for energy, that's actually GDP decretive. If you double labor productivity, ideally that means that you work just as many hours but gets paid twice as much, or maybe you only work half as many hours and work half as often. In reality, what often ends up is that half of your colleagues are superfluous. And I think we can take comfort from the fact that every time we have gone through an energy transition in the past, from the transition from muscle power to mechanical power to electrical power, dirty power to clean power, every one of those transitions has boosted labor productivity. And every one of those transitions has opened up a Schumpeterian revolution and created new industries that didn't exist before. But we are fooling ourselves if we think that the individuals in one sector can easily transition. It is patronizing, paternalistic, and naive to assume that a 55-year-old oil patch worker with a very specific, very highly skilled set of talents is going to go back to community college and get a degree in thin film deposition and go to work in a solar plant. It's frankly obnoxious to suggest that. The labor movement understands that. And the fact that the average boat will rise does not mean that all boats will rise. And we need to think about that transition and how to minimize the pain, because the analogy that I often use is that the industrialization of agriculture was a really good thing to do. The second half of Ma Jode's life was pretty miserable, right? And we just need to acknowledge we can welcome the change, but we have a moral obligation to acknowledge where the pain is. So thank you again. Hopefully I've given something to think about, and I really, really am looking forward to the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Congressman. First question goes to Jackie. We have lots of questions for you, but first one for Dr. Ashmore.
Great. And just before I ask my question, I'll remind the audience that we welcome their questions. We've got some coming into the Q&A panel already, but feel free to add more. And so one of my questions is about the Clean Energy Standard and the 2035 target. I've seen some speculation that if legislation to support that doesn't attract 60 votes in the Senate, you're assuming the filibuster remains in place, then the administration could turn to budget reconciliation to support achieving this goal. And what's your thinking on whether that might unfold, and if so, what it might look like?
I think we are all, especially on the House side of the Capitol Hill, we're all learning more about Senate procedure than we thought we had to right now. The budget reconciliation process, for those of you who don't know, that if you can describe something as a tweak to a budget, it only takes 51 votes to get through the Senate. And there were some changes to Obamacare that were made under that protocol to avoid the need for the filibuster. I think quite candidly, as I said before we started, the filibuster exists. John Calhoun invented it. It was a Civil War legacy to expand minority rights in an area where the majority of the country was really kind of down on slavery. And by the majority of the country, I'm including the people who weren't allowed to vote in that era, right? The filibuster is a totally anachronistic tool. And so does the Senate decide, if we can't get priorities through, to make a rule change to get rid of the filibuster, or do we start trying to jam things into budget reconciliation? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Personally, I wouldn't be inclined to take either question off the table. Ultimately, it won't be my decision, because this will be decisions made on the Senate side of the Hill. I will say, to be candid, that I think that the test case for how much the Senate chooses to flex is probably not going to be a clean energy standard. I think we're going to see probably in the next few months some of the COVID relief bills, some of the additional funding that's going to be required, some fairly structural things that have to happen to get the economy recovered from COVID. And I think those will probably be the high profile text cases of how much does the Senate want to flex?
Well, then let me follow up on that by asking you to lay out your schedule for Congress, not just the House, but from what you can read of the Senate tea leaves, and with respect to what are the major things that Congress has to get to before it gets to a major quote unquote infrastructure bill that will have significant energy provisions in it. And then after that, we'll go to some of the provisions that people are talking about.
So in the discussions that we've had with House leadership and with the Biden White House, I think it's safe to say that we are at this moment, we are in a triage moment, and we just have to focus on the triage. What did we had the first quarter with net job losses in the last quarter that just came out. The unemployment rate for the bottom quartile of wealth in this country is 20%. That is depression level unemployment. And as long as the virus is still surging, what are we, 3,000, 4,000 deaths a day right now? We just got to get the public health behind us. So you're going to see an immediate, push really around nationalizing vaccine distribution, getting vaccines out as quickly as possible, implementation of the Defense Production Act, huge increases in testing and PPE, and trying to make sure that we've got the economic protection for folks who've been dislocated. I think there's going to be a big near-term fight on state and local funding, because we've really not given resources in any of the bills that we got through, because we didn't have support of the Trump White House or the McConnell-led Senate, to make sure that we look out for teachers, for firefighters, for police. We've effectively been defunding the police every time we failed to get state and local funding out. So there's going to be big pushes, and these are multi-trillion-dollar packages. And I think that's probably going to dominate the next month or so. There is a very broad, and I think bipartisan recognition that as we get into the spring, even if we don't have COVID under control, construction is a great way to get the economy going. You can, outdoor work, you can do it safely. And so I think you're going to start to see a lot of pushes around pretty major infrastructure packages. You'll probably see the conversation start in a month or so. I think it'll probably be a little longer to come through. I think it's really significant both that the Biden administration has said that they're going to treat the climate crisis an emergency and not worry about the cost. And we in the House changed our rules this term to say that for COVID and for climate matters, we're not going to imply our pay-go rule. In other words, we're not going to have to find a way to cut expenses from some other bucket to pay for that, because the costs of inaction are far greater than the cost of action. So we now have the statutory tools, both from the House and from the White House, to make a significant infrastructure investment that is climate focused. And so I think there's a potential for a real infrastructure piece. Now, once those two are done, some of these larger structural issues that you mentioned, things like a clean energy standard, I think those are going to take time, but my hope is that as we work through those, with any luck, knock wood if you got it, we'll find some way to ease back some of these constraints that no good policy can move forward unless it has 61 votes in the Senate.
So like everyone else, I'm on a million email lists, and I got one from a very major Wall Street bank, which basically just yesterday predicted what was going to be in that that infrastructure bill. Let's say 2 or 3 months from now. Does that sound right, Congressman? Something like that?
I think you'll probably have the contours of a bill 2 to 3 months from now. I'm a little hard pressed to see that we pass something on the floor and have it signed into law in 2 to 3 months. But
fair enough. Fair enough. We start the debate in earnest 2 or 3 months from now. And here's they said what's in: storage tax credit, support for clean manufacturing, EV infrastructure, green hydrogens, and CCS. That's in, and they said clean energy standard is kind of on the bubble. Don't bet on it. Does that sound about right to you?
I sure hope not. Look, that's a description. Remember what I said at the start. We got to do what's scientifically necessary, not what's politically possible. Any serious plan that includes CCS is not a serious plan, right? There's no way that you take a technology like coal-fired power that is not economic as it sits here right now and make it economic by increasing the capital cost so that you can increase the operating cost and put more parasitic loads on the plant. It's something you throw money off to buy off some coal state senators, and then you waste finite resources to do something silly. I think what an infrastructure plan should be, and I hope has in it, is huge increase in EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure, huge increase in mass transit and high-speed rail, which Biden has certainly talked about. Big money for transmission. Let's debottleneck the country. Let's truly have a national electric grid so that we can connect renewables to other parts of the grid and give them long-term contracts where they can offset that. Big increases in broadband, and then a whole lot of push, I think, more in the vertical infrastructure. How do we make our buildings, our homes, our schools, our federal buildings more energy efficient? Reduce the pull for energy at the downstream end of the wire, so that we don't have to build as much on the front end. And I think those pieces are going to be fairly critical. And that's, of course, before you get into all the questions around resilience. Should we be building more property on Miami Beach? It's a tough question. If we are, what's it going to look like? Yeah.
Just a little follow-up to that, Congressman. I agree with you on coal-based CCS, but what gas-based CCS might actually compete fairly with firmed up solar and wind in some parts of the country, certainly in some parts of the world?
Well, I guess, Peter, like if markets decide to do it, markets will do it. I don't want to judge that, but I think when you look around all of the technologies that we could and would deploy, if the only driver was what is the lowest cost source of reliable power, right? There's so many, like we wouldn't have coal plants anymore. We wouldn't build simple cycle gas turbines, except where we need them just for load farming, because they can, quick ramp up and down. And even natural gas CCS, I think it's hard for me to see how we get back to 1985 CO2 levels if we don't have some direct air capture. The challenge with direct air capture is there's no revenue, right? And so we talk about these ways to say, well, could we help bring this technology forward by either putting it on the back of an asset that is generating electricity, or maybe by pumping the gas underground so that we can accelerate the recovery of oil, enhanced oil recovery, which makes it sort of dubious whether it's actually reducing CO2 emissions. The thermodynamics, the mass and energy balances of that are pretty straightforward, but the economics of saying, how do you build direct air capture if you don't have any revenue that's coming in to justify a fairly sizable capital investment? That's a hard question. But I'm still left saying, if you take CO2 out of it, would you build? It's not like people who are building new combined cycle gas plants are earning triple-digit returns on their investment. There's an old saying in the power industry: everybody wants to be the third owner of a power plant. It's not. So my point is, this is already a capital-intensive, low-margin industry. Putting more capital on that and a higher operating cost, it's very hard to seeing that be something that a market is really going to embrace. Can we throw money at it? Sure, but it's hard for me to see a market doing that unless we have exhausted every other opportunity to build lower cost and lower carbon generation, which we're nowhere close to doing that. I come back to the Switzerland example. They use half as much energy as we do per dollar GDP. They didn't get there with CCS.
Right. Well, thank you, Congressman. I think Jackie's got some great questions from the Q&A.
Absolutely. We've got a lot of wonderful questions coming in. And so I'm going to kick it off with one from Sue Chang, who asks, with respect to public messaging, why is the magnitude of fossil fuel subsidies not emphasized more frequently? Why is there not more awareness of that?
Oh, I think I have a real short answer, which is that in politics, losers always cry louder than winners cheer. If you've got something to lose, you make a big deal about it, and you're very keenly aware of it. If you've got something to gain, but you're a startup and you're in an industry that's sort of a nascent industry that doesn't really, you probably don't even know all the things you have to gain, right? So there's a handful of us, myself, Senator Whitehouse, Earl Blumenauer. There's a handful of us who have been beating this drum as loud as we can. It's not something that I think is broadly understood by the larger body politic. I wish it was, but Sue, maybe you can help. Scream it from the rooftops if you would.
Excellent. We have another question from Holly Kaufman, who's asking if you have recommendations to mayors as to what they should ask of the Biden administration and Congress for cities to be carbon neutral. What do you think their asks should be, and where should they intervene? Should it be during budget reconciliation, in the stimulus debate, or bill development, or some other point?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't know that there's a generic answer, because every mayor is going to have a slightly different set of circumstances. I think one of the things that's going to be really critical, which becomes an international issue, and the mayors, the mayors conference has been fairly vocal about this. In Glasgow, COP26, which should have already happened, but it's been delayed because of COVID, one of the tracks that they're on is we need to come up with standardized international carbon accounting. And if we don't do that, the circumstance that one mayor may, if you're the mayor of a city who buys all of your power from a coal plant in another state, who owns the carbon credit for that? And if by virtue of doing that, you shut down a gas plant in your city, how does that allowance go through? If you invest in efficiency that reduces your load, who owns the reduced output from that downstream? I don't mean to say this straight to power, but obviously you can think through all that stuff. And I think really pushing for saying we need a consistent set of accounting so that all the mayors are rowing in the same direction and say, we know what the scoreboard is. We're all going to be evaluated on the same scoreboard. Let's go forward. And again, the international community recognizes that. The US, because we pulled out of Paris, we're not at the table when some of those discussions were happening at COP25 in Madrid, where I was last year. We're now coming back in. We had monitors there, but I think really engaging and getting clarity on that quickly is going to be important.
Great. And a question from Manir Azam, who's interested in your view on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, as in the revenue neutral carbon tax. Question is that helpful, and is it necessary to help build confidence between parties, or too little too late and a distraction from bigger action, or what's your perspective on that?
So I have been very outspokenly hostile to the fee and dividend structure going back for a decade. And so I can't hide behind what I've said before, because you'll find it if you Google it on the web, but I want to be really clear about it. Take what I said before. If I go to buy a pair of shoes, let's say I buy a $120 pair of shoes. I pay $120 for my pair of shoes and the shoe store gets 120 bucks. That creates an economic incentive for the shoe store to be in the shoe selling business, creates an incentive for me to find a $110 pair of shoes if I can. This is like basic kind of Adam Smithy stuff. If, on the other hand, I say I'm going to pay the government $120, and the government is then going to see to it that I get a pair of shoes. That's the essence of socialism, right? Or communism, if you like. That is essentially what a carbon tax is. Because a carbon tax is, you're going to pay me for the right to have a pair of shoes, and I am then going to see to it that the money I receive creates a shoe manufacturing and distribution industry. A tax and dividend is even worse, because a tax and dividend says, I'm going to take that money you gave me for shoes, and then I'm going to spend it on things that have nothing to do with shoe manufacturing. I'm just going to give it to everybody as a dividend, right? And it's really tempting, because you can see a path to making it pass, because every member of Congress wants to play Santa. If we can give our constituents trillions of dollars, man, it's easy for us to get reelected. But the goal of carbon policy is not for us to get reelected. The goal of carbon policy is not to pass a bill. The goal of carbon policy is not to figure out how to get bipartisan consensus. The goal of carbon policy is to reduce CO2 emissions, period. And if we take money and then use that money for things other than reducing CO2, then we have this huge bet riding on a guess that raising the price of carbon emissions is going to cause money to flow to people who might reduce CO2 emissions. That is a massive economic bet, and I just submit to you, I sit in the Financial Services Committee. Last year, Wells Fargo got $3 billion of fines. Show me an economist who says that allowed Citibank to provide you a higher rate of deposits on the money that you have in their account. And yet we have economists who will tell you that if you put a price on carbon at a coal plant, it's somehow going to make a solar developer richer. So I think that the fee and dividend structure is a really, really bad economic idea that has the particular curse that you could actually probably pass it into law.
Let me follow up on that, Congressman, as a sometime economist. I thought I heard you support the idea of a price signal on carbon, not tax and dividend. Did I hear wrong in your?
So I absolutely support a price signal. The key is that for a market to work, and again, I use the acid rain trading protocol, the acid rain program of the Montreal Protocol as examples of how to do it right, where a source pays a sink, right? And the revenue received by one is what's received by the other. So my problem with tax and dividend, not that it has a carbon price, it's that there's no express flow of money to the person who's reducing carbon. So the bill that we introduced last term that we'll be reintroducing says that everybody gets, every power generator, every thermal generator gets an allowance to pollute per MMBTU of thermal energy or per megawatt hour of electrical energy. And that allowance ratchets down over time to zero. But now if you are north of that line, you have to buy the excess above. If you're south of that line, you have something to sell, and you enter into a transaction between two private parties where you've now got a long-term contract for either the additional carbon you're releasing above that level or the carbon that you're causing to reduce. And there is no government intermediary. We're taking advantage of markets. And again, that's really the way that I think the initial ideas around using market signals to regulate pollution, that's how they worked. We connected sources and sinks. And where we've lost the thread is saying, we're still going to require the sources to pay, but we're going to decouple that from the sink and intermediate the government in between to figure out how to allocate those monies.
Well, the economist in me thinks that will work, Congressman, but I have to ask you that in the taxonomy of language that politicians and economists use, that would be considered a particular form of cap and trade, a very carefully, thoughtfully designed one. How do you get around Senator Manchin and the vilifiers of cap and trade with that idea?
There's a question around political language, but when I've talked about this bill to some colleagues in the Coal Belt, including in West Virginia, their question is really what is going to happen to the coal producer? And so let's take right now, like let's say that to make the math simple, let's say we start with an allowance at 1,000 pounds a megawatt hour, and you can reduce it over time. And what we've said in the bill is that if you enter into a long-term contract with a clean source, you can lock in the current rate. So even though you're getting 1,000 pounds this year, 900 pounds next year, 800 pounds the following year, you can lock in at 1,000 if you enter into a long-term contract with a clean generator. Well, that actually has a lot of benefit to people in a region like Mr. Manchin is from, because now the coal plants have an allowance to release 1,000 pounds a megawatt hour. Now they're going to release about 2,000 if they're a typical coal plant. So they're going to have to buy the other 1,000, but they are getting a financial protection and they're getting visibility to ease that transition out. And what Manchin knows, what everybody in the Coal Belt knows, is that coal is dying. There's nothing you can do to bring it back. I joked with one of my colleagues that I said, if your goal is to protect coal jobs, you must hate longwall mining, because longwall mining really killed the coal industry way more than solar did, right? So they know those jobs are going away. They're focused on how to manage the transition. And this actually gives them a glide path to a transition that a traditional thou shalt pay if you emit doesn't give them.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Why don't we go back to the questions?
Fantastic. So Bob Kleinberg points out that the EPA headcount is down by 20% over the last 10 years. And do you think agencies like the EPA should be rebuilt? And if so, how can the administration make that happen?
Quite true. I think I think we will at least have an administration now that's submitting realistic budgets. And just to tell a story for context, because I sit on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, we have oversight of the DOE budget, at least substantial parts of the DOE budget. And the first budget cycle I went through, we had Rick Perry come in, and he was proposing a 90% cut in various Great Lakes funding programs. And we said to him, how do you justify a 90% cut? And he said, under oath, cameras running before the committee, I know you'll restore it, so it doesn't really matter. And we sat there, my colleague Ed Perlmutter, he said, who told you to cut by 90%? Like, aren't you supposed to propose a budget? He said, OMB just said to cut, so we did it. So we basically had a White House that was just assuming that Congress would set budgets. I guess it gave us more power, but Congress we have a lot fewer staff than the executive branch does. We have a lot more on our plate than people in an agency who are deep in the deeds of those budgets. So I think there's a recognition in the Biden White House that there's a need to make sure that you actually have the tools and intellectual power and computational power to implement your mandates. And so we're going to get more realistic budgets from them. I'm sure we won't agree with every piece of their budget, but we'll at least be working jointly to figure out what are the needs and how do we put this together in a way. Once we agree on what you have to do, let's figure out how to make sure it's funded at appropriate levels, instead of saying we disagree with what we have to do, and oh, by the way, we're not even going to try to put a budget together. Is that going to be enough? I don't know, but it will certainly be an improvement.
Excellent. So Belle Hartman asked what role you see for nature-based sustainable drawdown of greenhouse gases, whether that's agriculture, oceans, wetlands, reforestation, and do you think some of this could be accomplished by compensating farmers, forest landowners and others for the CO2 sequestered?
So I am massively intrigued by agricultural paths to negative emissions. And it is really, really hard to think about structurally how to do them. The intrigue starts in the fact that, and Al Gore has been very outspoken about this. My colleague Shelley Pingree, that some of you probably know from up the road in Maine, has been very outspoken. That if you look at the carbon that was held in soils 100 years ago and compare it to the carbon content in soils today, if we went back to where it was 100 years ago, you probably pull somewhere between 80 and 90 parts per million out of the atmosphere. These are enormous numbers. And an awful lot of the things that led to the reduction in carbon soils were changes in practices that were probably not the best for the farmer. Loss of topsoil, channelization of waterways across farms, some of the sort of aggressive the whole sort of panoply of regenerative agricultural techniques. And so there's a lot of tools that you could contemplate doing that would be good for the farmer, good for the environment, and would go negative. What gets tricky is number one, a lot of that's international, right? It's one thing to tell a soy farmer in Illinois to change some agricultural practices. It's something else to say to someone in Indonesia who's cutting down rainforests to build palm oil plantations that they should restore the rainforest. Those are hard, right? I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying they're hard. The second piece that's really hard is that I think for the regulation to work, it needs to be more practice than price-based, because a price-based regulation is going to inherently have to take some big smooshing around what is I can't actually be certain that your practice leads to 52.3792 tons of carbon in the soil, right? Even though I know directionally that if everybody did this practice, we'd lead to a reduction. And so it's a very tricky metering issue to fit into other carbon pricing regimes. And so we've got to figure out a way to work those practices. And I think some of the most interesting conversations I've had has been with farmers in downstate Illinois who have adopted these practices. I talked to one guy who said that he made these changes. His revenue is the same, but his operating expenses are down $500,000 a year right now. That's a big deal. And I said to him, I said, you got to color me skeptical, because if you're right, the implication is that farmers are too stupid to do what's in their economic interests. And I can't believe that's true. So why is that? And he had this really interesting line that he said, he said, in the agricultural sector, you have to travel 500 miles before you're accepted as a profit. And it was just really, because he said, this is an industry that's not a super high margin industry. It is very lowercase c conservative. And he said, among my neighbors, I'm the guy who farms dirty, right? My field doesn't look as clean. It's got things that look like weeds growing in it. I'm not farming the way dad farmed. I'm not farming the way grandpa farmed. And I'm not trusted. He said, on the other hand, if I drive where nobody knows me and I say, here's my numbers, they believe me. And so I think there's a really interesting opportunity. Maybe there's an opportunity that universities can play of how do we sort of amplify those stories and educate farmers with people who are trusted as farmers, not me from a suburban congressional district, but people who've got legit credibility within that community, because there's definitely an opportunity there.
Absolutely, that's a very interesting anecdote, thank you. So turning to environmental justice and energy equity, Courtney Eichhorst is asking how to ensure equity through the energy transition, noting that lower income households already have a high energy burden in many cases, as high as 33% we hear in areas of Rhode Island. So what policy mechanisms have you considered and would like to see in place to mitigate regressive outcomes?
So the first is that we've got to not fall for the wrong set of facts. Anything we do to make our energy system cleaner is also going to make our energy system cheaper. And if you don't believe me, just look at the scoreboard. When FERC passed Order 888 and then Congress passed the 92 Energy Policy Act, Peter, I suspect you were involved in some of those things. We basically embraced markets in the electric sector. The nuclear fleet went from 60% capacity factor to 90% capacity factor, not because the operators wanted to be carbon free, but because they realized that they could make more money by operating their lower marginal cost assets. We saw 200,000 megawatts of combined cycle natural gas installed in about a 10-year period, which is almost twice as efficient as the fleet it replaced, not because people were driven by being cleaner, but because they said, if I build lower marginal cost assets, I can get through. That's 20% of the whole US power grid was built in 10 years after those bills were passed. The result of that was that the price of power has fallen by about 6% on an inflation adjusted basis. And the CO2 emissions per megawatt hour have fallen by about 27%. I don't care whether you're stinking rich or stinking poor, that's a pretty good deal all around, right? And so the single best thing we can do to help lower the cost of the energy burden on the less fortunate is to accelerate the deployment of cleaner, cheaper energy. Now, having said that, there are really legitimate issues with environmental justice. And I think a big part of the challenge, and it's what I said about Ma Jode before, if you live in one of these hollers in Appalachia, that's a place that geographically is really hard to support a first world economy. It's hard to build roads, it's hard to build power lines, it's hard to build broadband. People live there because they've got tremendous mineral resources, right? Those jobs are going away. And there's what's the Brookings paper, the deaths of despair, the rises in suicide and opiate addiction that are overwhelmingly concentrated in those parts of the country is a direct result of that. Is an environmental justice issue, but it's a loss of revenue, not an increase of expenses. And even though I think we can acknowledge that, like I said, cheaper energy is good, that also means we're spending less money on energy, which means there's less money flowing to people who depended on the production of energy for their livelihood. And we have to figure out a way to make that transition. And then, of course, there's the whole other suite of environmental justice issues of, the person who is zoned to be in a neighborhood where it's easy to zone a steel mill next door. We need to deal with those issues. Those are, but the economics issue, I think, is the economics of energy price is the easy one.
Excellent. I'm seeing a lot of people are really interested in that example you raised around how the energy transition is going to be incredibly hard for those who are currently highly skilled in areas that are becoming obsolete and who may be reluctant to retrain. And so what are your thoughts on how to incentivize the workforce transition to a new clean economy? And Sarah Finney-Robinson, who asked this question, works a lot on communications, and she's interested in whether effective communication is part of the solution.
So there's a whole lot of good bills around retraining, and I think as a government we've got an obligation, in any event, to make sure that people have the educational tools and the opportunities to live up to their full potential. And I think we can stipulate that generically, and we can stipulate that we've not always done a great job of that. That's retraining is a subset of that. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that we as a species, not we as Americans or as a government, we're really bad at predicting what the jobs of the future are going to be. And that's fine, but we got to at least acknowledge it. I think back when I was in high school, that if you wanted to be rich, everybody said you should be a doctor or a lawyer. By the time I got to college, everybody said if you want to be rich, you should be a banker. By the time I was out of grad school, I said if you want to be rich, you should go into tech. And that narrative, I think over, the 15-year period I just described, was essentially a transition from the expectation that if you were highly skilled, you would be paid for your hourly rate of work at a high rate, to a transition to, if you own the robots, you can make a lot of money, right? From cash to equity compensation. And that's hard, right? And I'm not, without taking an opinion of whether that's good or bad, I think to assume that we know that somebody who is currently underemployed, if they invest the time to retrain in a certain industry, they will be set up for the future. I think we have to be a little bit more humble about that, right? And I also think the reason I said at the start that I think we need to avoid being patronizing is, if, let's say you're someone who spent your career working in the oil patch, and you've done unconventional drilling, and you know how to maneuver really, really complicated rotating machinery miles and miles underground. You've got deep understanding of geology and IT. You are an extremely skilled individual. That is a very different set of skills than being a wind turbine maintenance technician, right? We should also point out that if you worked at a coal plant, and there aren't really a lot of jobs working at a solar plant, right? You don't need fuel handlers, you don't need ash handlers, you don't need fuel buyers, you don't need high temperature pipe welders. There's just, it is an increase in labor productivity, but fewer jobs. And so I think I think while we should absolutely make sure that we give people, all the opportunities in the world to retrain for a career they want to have, we also need to acknowledge that for some significant number of them, for reasons of their geography, their particular life situation, their desire to be retrained, willingness to be retrained, there's going to be some people who are individually lost out in that transition, even if the average person is way better off. And I think we just need to acknowledge that and be a decent, moral, ethical person about making sure that we help out folks in that situation as well.
If I might interject a little anecdote, a little hopeful anecdote, give you a chance to take a breath. And Congressman, I was talking to a geothermal heat pump company installing residential heat pumps, and it is using the same directional drilling techniques that are used in natural gas today for the first time in order to drill horizontally to create economical loops. And they were talking about the need for highly skilled drilling technicians, and that the only place they would find them is people coming out of the gas industry. So let's look for the reuse of those very, very unique skills. And I think there are some that we can find. While I agree with your broad point that we must not be patronizing or make assumptions, facile assumptions about the ability to retrain.
Sure. There are a lot of areas that overlap. I mean, like having spent a long time in the clean energy space, we never did landfill gas because the people who were really good at landfill gas were people who knew how to manage depleting fields. That was different than stuff that we knew, like being energy efficiency nerds. It's a different skill set, but it ties much more closely to the fossil industry. So there are overlaps there. It's just, I think we would like to believe that there are that this is a net increase in jobs in that sector. I don't think we should assume that unless we can bear it out with the numbers before thinking about the consequence on individual lives.
Thank you. Jackie, I think we have time for maybe two more questions before we wrap up.
Sounds good to me. And so Ron McNamara asked, noting that decarbonisation is obviously a generational issue, national debt is also a generational issue. And what are your thoughts on ways to address both issues simultaneously?
In my dream world, we have a much more sophisticated conversation about the national debt pretty quickly. If you own a house and you think your house is going to appreciate faster than the interest payments on your debt, how nervous are you? Now, if let's say you got $500,000 tied into your mortgage, if you instead borrowed $500,000 to pay for a really, really nice vacation last year and you're paying the same interest rate on the debt, how concerned are you? Presumably you're a lot more concerned about the latter than the former. The way that we do fiscal decision-making in Washington, we make no distinction between those two. So when we borrow money to invest in highways and roads and our military and education, we treat that exactly the same way as spending money to increase my salary, right? As an example. Those are really, really different things. And one of the things that we're in the early stages of a bill to do this term is to follow the UK's lead, that the UK actually maintains a national balance sheet. And so when regulators in the UK are making decisions about bills, they don't only look at what impact this will have on our borrowing, but what impact will this have on our asset base? And that does a couple of huge things. Number one, if we're sitting there right now saying the US can borrow money at 2%, and we can put that money to work in things that are going to grow our GDP by 5, 6, 7%, that's called an accretive equity investment. Take it all day long, right? And we would do that if we had a national balance sheet and use that to make our decisions. It also hurts us the other way, though, because when we sell off parcels of federal land for below market oil and gas exploration, we treat that as a source of cash. We don't treat it as a write down of our balance sheet, right? And the fact that the source of cash is less than what we wrote down in our balance sheet never factors into our thinking. Even though you as a homeowner, if you had that $500,000 tied up in your mortgage, and then somebody came along and said, I'll buy your house from you for $300,000. I'll give you a second. You probably wouldn't take that deal, right? But in the federal government, we don't make that distinction because we don't look at what the write down is on that asset. And so I think getting to a point where we do what countries like the UK have already done would put us in a position. It doesn't solve the national debt, but it at least allows us to distinguish between money that we are borrowing for good and accretive things, which are in the long term going to be a good use of borrowing, and money that we're borrowing for wasteful purposes. And just giving us the tool to understand that would make me much more confident that we'll make the right decisions.
I think we may be out of time, Jackie, because we want to give the Congressman a moment for his final thoughts, and we want to thank all of you who have been listening to this and joining us, and our sponsors. First, Congressman, any final thoughts before we wrap up? We want to thank you so much for this extremely thought-provoking, incredibly rich and deep conversation. We were hoping to get into these kinds of issues with you, and it's such a pleasure to have this dialogue. And I think we're the hundreds of us on this call are very, very grateful. So any final thoughts? We face a very, very important period in Congress.
Well, I want to thank you and all the folks at BU for making this possible, and I want to especially thank everybody who's participating. The energy policy is complicated. And I think we're at a moment in our history right now where we are out of time to get this wrong, right? Maybe if we had gotten into Kyoto, we could have made some mistakes and tweaked it. We not only have to move quickly, we also have to get this right. And I think we're at a moment in our history where there are political voices saying that this problem is too complicated to move quickly. And there are political voices saying this problem is too urgent to get bogged down in complexity. And either of those doors is suicidal. And I thank you for participating, for the depth of the questions, because our ability to leave a better planet for our kids than the ones we inherited from our parents is going to depend on our ability to deal with this with the urgency that it requires, with full understanding of the complexity that it has. And so it's obvious from the questions, you got people who understand that. So thank you, and thank you all for participating.
Well, thank you again, Congressman. It's been a real pleasure. We'd like to again thank our sponsors. Maybe we can put up the slide real quick if you can, Robert. And while we do that, thank Robert Perry and Laura Hurley, who helped put this together on our end. Your staff, Congressman, who are wonderful to work with. AEE, NECEC, the Energy and Sustainability Club, NASIO, our colleagues at the Association of State Energy Officials, and at BU, our colleagues in political science and the Pardee School of Global Studies. Please join us again for our other Energy of the Future conversations. Here they are. They're all posted at bu.edu/ISE/spring21. Take a look at our website, bu.edu/ISE. And with that, Dr. Jackie Ashmore and me, Peter Fox Penner, Congressman Sean Casten, we say thank you very much. Congressman, stay strong, stay safe, and may the force be with you.
Thank you all so much. Take care, everybody.